Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for today's event featuring George Serafeim, who is the Charles M. Williams Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. We are delighted that he's joining us today to speak about his book, Purpose and Profit: How Business Can Lift Up the World. My name is Lorzan Aksoy, and I have the honor of serving as the Interim Dean of the Gabelli School of Business here at Fordham University. And on behalf of the Gabelli School, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today. I'm particularly excited about today's session because it aligns so perfectly with the mission of our school, which is to educate compassionate, global, ethical leaders who will use the power of business to move society forward. I strongly believe we're educating these leaders and that the world needs them now more than ever. In the last several years, Fordham's Gabelli Center for Security Analysis and our wonderful co-presenters, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York, have sponsored more than 50 events that have drawn more than 8,000 attendees. We are tremendously proud of this dynamic collaboration, and a full archive of our video content will be shared with you in the thank you email you will receive. Now, I would like to turn it over to my dear colleague, Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Professor of Accounting, Barbara Porso, to introduce our guest of honor.
Welcome, everyone. Professor George Serafeim also co-leads the Impact Weighted Accounts Project and the Climate Sustainability Impact AI Lab at Harvard University. His current teaching portfolio of dynamic courses are part of Harvard's MBA curriculum. And on a personal note, his work inspired me to pursue postdoctoral studies at Harvard over a decade ago. Professor Serafeim has presented his research in over 60 countries around the world and ranks among the top 10 most popular authors out of over 12,000 business authors on the Social Science Research Network. He has received numerous awards for his extraordinary contributions in the field of sustainability. We are thrilled he joins us today to share some key highlights from his new book, newly published this summer and required reading in two of my courses this upcoming spring. His book explores the challenges and opportunities in building and sustaining profitable, purpose-driven organizations that are based on measuring a positive impact on society. Based on more than a decade of his cutting-edge research, Professor Serafeim takes readers through this journey to better understand how costs and expenses, we can see them in a new lens, shifting the understanding to perceive them as assets and opportunities, and ultimately how business can lift up the world. I invite him to join us to share more about his book and key concepts, and the book's title is Purpose and Profit. Welcome, George Serafeim.
Thank you very much for having me here today, and many thanks to Dean Aksoy, to Professor Porso, and Professor Chatterjee as well for inviting me to be here with you. I'm very thrilled to be speaking with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions as well. As Professor Porso just mentioned, I recently completed the book, Purpose and Profit: How Business Can Lift Up the World, because I have witnessed an enormous amount of interest among graduate students, undergrad students, and mid-career professionals as they are looking at their careers and as they are looking at the impact that they can create on the world and how they can couple and bundle purpose and profit, and how can they use purpose as the fuel for increasing profitability and creating more sustainable business models and more sustainable strategies. At the same time, I have witnessed many of the challenges and risks that come as in the journey towards creating more sustainable business models and creating business models and strategies that are aiming to deliver more positive impact on the world. And these are the challenges and opportunities, as Professor Porso just mentioned, that we need to be thinking about as business leaders and thinking about when we're actually trying to create new business models and new strategies to better the world in front of us. So if we can put the slides forward, I would like to show you a couple of, I think, key messages from the book and key ingredients of the research that bring to life many of the things that we have uncovered in that research journey. I think the first really important point is to understand how the world has changed over time. And I think this is a very, very important message, because the world and the competitiveness of businesses is a very dynamic concept rather than a static concept. The reason why this is also important is because many people can say, well, I have been very, very successful competing for decades and creating businesses. And I didn't ever thought about environmental issues. I never thought about social issues. I never thought about governance issues. But why do I need to think about those issues? And I think part of the answer is because the world now is very, very different than the world decades ago. And the world is very, very different for multiple reasons. But one of the fundamental ones is the role that technology now plays in our world and in our lives. We're living in a world that is much, much more transparent, and in a world that actually provides much more choice, both from an employee perspective, but also from a customer perspective. And let me elaborate a little bit on that. Sometimes in the classroom as well, for example, I teach a case on a consumer goods company that is looking to decarbonize its supply chain. And of course, when we are looking at food companies, for example, deforestation is a really, really big issue. So the question to ask is how, for example, a big food company could actually make sure that its suppliers are not engaging in deforestation and that our products are free from deforestation. And the answer is decades ago that this was extremely costly, if not impossible, because there was no mechanism to actually create a market that is able to monitor practices in the supply chain. But now, because of satellite imaging, because of drone technology, and because of computer vision, it has actually become much lower cost and certainly feasible to understand what is happening in the supply chain. The same thing when it comes to employment practices. How it was possible to understand good or bad employment practices in supply chains around the world decades ago? And the answer was that it was not possible, actually. We had very, very little transparency around it. But now anybody can take a picture with their smartphone, put it on Twitter, and then it blows up, creating a very, very competitive landscape and affecting the reputation risk, the legal risk, and other fundamental drivers of the ability of organizations to compete over time. And we can see that actually the role that technology plays, the role that all the technologies that I just mentioned are creating a very different landscape with very, very different incentives. And what I call in the book of the price of bad behavior actually has increased over time, meaning that it has become costlier and costlier to actually engage in bad behavior in operations, in supply chains, and in the product impacts that your organization is having. At the same time, what has happened is that the benefits of good behavior have actually increased over time. And the most fundamental driver of this is where talent is going to the economy. Increasingly, more and more skilled employees, talented employees, are actually wanting to go to organizations that are making the world a better place. And they are asking for that meaning and purpose from their work. I had witnessed it personally with my own students, where 15 years ago, issues of, for example, what is the type of impact that I'm having from my work? What's the meaning of my work? What's the impact of my organization on issues such as, for example, climate change or access and affordability or health and safety and so forth? We're just not on the radar of most people. And increasingly, all students are asking those kind of questions. How can I have a financially attractive career, but at the same time, make the world a better place? And as more and more the competitiveness of organizations actually depends on the human, social, and intellectual capital that organizations are able to create, therefore, those talent flows and the ability to attract, retain, and grow important talent inside the organization becomes increasingly important. So organizations that are able to credibly showcase the positive impact that they are having on customers and the broader world are actually able to attract better talent. And of course, as part of that, they are creating trust with society and with their customers as well, which is what we describe as social capital. So as a result, both the price of bad behavior has actually increased over time, but also the benefits of actually having positive impact have increased over time. And that is happening because of the role of voice and what you see there, because of the increased ability to actually choose among employers, among brands, among companies that you want to be associated with. And the same thing in capital markets as well, with the expansion of choice. And because of how value is being distributed right now, and because of how value is more and more dependent on human, social, intellectual capital, that is increasingly affecting the profitability, capital allocation, and competitiveness of organizations around the world. Of course, that doesn't mean that all bad behavior is punished and that all good behavior is rewarded. But certainly, over time, it has become less difficult and more rewarding of building and sustaining purpose-driven organizations that have a positive, measurable impact on society. And I think that dynamic perspective is incredibly important to keep in mind. The world is not a static place. Rather, the institutions that shape society around us are actually changing over time. And for me, what was really important was to actually dig deeper and understand what are the archetypes, what are the different types of value creation that we're observing organizations to engage with in this context of environmental, social, and governance issues or sustainability issues. And as we're thinking about that, the first thing that we need to recognize as part of this dynamic perspective is that, again, the price of actually bad behavior, good behavior has actually changed over time. Here is a graph from one of my papers that actually illustrates that dynamic perspective, that when you actually look at the market valuation multiples of companies within an industry, these are competitor companies. Think about, for example, PepsiCo versus Coca-Cola. Think about, for example, JP Morgan versus Bank of America. So these are competitors within industries. And you ask the question about when you're actually comparing companies that are tending to be leaders versus laggards when it comes to performance on material, the strategically important and industry important ESG issues within their industry, are the leaders trading at a premium relative to the discount or not? And what you see here is that historically, actually, the leaders tended to trade at a discount relative to the laggards in their industries. And part of that was because actually the world was a very different place. Those activities were actually not paying off. But over time, as things have shifted and as with increased availability of information and how that information is actually embedded into regulatory structures, affecting regulations around the world, how it is actually affecting consumer behavior, how it is affecting talent flows in labor markets, and how it is affecting capital markets and capital flows, that has shifted. And over time, actually, those activities are viewed not through the lens of an expense in the income statement, but rather through a lens of an asset in a balance sheet. And this is what you see here as well. But what are the business models of value creation? As part of the book, I have created these 6 archetypes of value creation that represent almost a ladder. And as you are moving towards up and right, what happens is that the opportunity for value creation through that archetype is increasing, but at the same time, what is increasing in the implementation risk inside the strategy of the organization. So another way of saying that is that actually returns might be going up from those activities, but also risk is going up from those activities. Those activities are actually more difficult to implement. So let's try to decompose and understand them pretty systematically. The first one, and the easier to implement. But at the same time, although value can be created, this is on the smaller side of the value creation, is what I call a disclosure strategy driven, basically increasing the multiples, because actually you're differentiating in the market from some of those competitors in terms of important risks that the organization might be facing. For example, if you actually look at mining companies, of course, in mining, safety issues are really important. Actually, having strong safety systems in a mine can actually make it more productive, but at the same time secure its license to operate. The same thing for community relationships or for waste issues around mines. And when you are thinking about, for example, a technology company, data privacy issues is a really, really important risk from that perspective. So in different industries, different risks, when you actually view them from the perspective of their societal impact, are important. Not everything will be important in every industry of the economy. So you really need to adopt an industry-specific lens. And what some companies have done, have said, look, I'm a mining company, but I'm much better at managing my safety issues. Or I'm a technology company and I'm much better than other technology companies at managing data privacy issues. Or I'm an energy company and I'm much better and carbon efficient, for example. And as a result, I have lower regulatory risk from carbon regulations. So, and they are disclosing that, differentiating themselves, and as a result, being able to actually communicate that they have lower risk relative to competitors and differentiate themselves, expanding their multiples as a result relative to their competitors. The second layer of that is what I call an operations management driven strategy that is actually lowering costs inside the organizations. This is one of the levers that most organizations by now have pulled, and they have been able to create tremendous actually efficiencies inside their operating structures. And this is what we call operating efficiency. Actually, one of the first cases that I ever wrote and I taught at Harvard Business School around those issues was a case on one of the largest chemical companies, where in the 90s and the early 2000s, they invested about $1 billion to actually improve operating efficiency by reducing energy and reducing water in the production processes and reducing waste actually as part of the manufacturing process, and at the same time improve working practices, improve safety practices, and so forth. And what they found was that that actually generated $5 billion over the next 5 years in terms of operating efficiencies and declines in costs. And this is something that many, many organizations, thousands of organizations around the world have now actually realized, and they have implemented, increasing their competitiveness over time. And of course, relative to the disclosure strategy, as you can see, that operations-driven strategy is a little bit more difficult. It actually requires you to make differences in how you run the manufacturing process, the organization process, the industrial process, and so forth. The third strategy is what I call opportunistic, product-driven strategy that is affecting revenue growth. So you can see that the first layer is affecting valuation multiples because of changes in risk. The second one is affecting your cost structures. So you can trace it in an income statement, for example, in sales, general, and administrative expenses, or in cost of goods sold, and so forth. The third one is actually affecting the top line of the income statement, and it's affecting the revenue growth of organization. And this is something that some organizations that are situated in specific markets have been able to pull. And they have been able to pull that lever because they are finding their products becoming more competitive because of changes in markets that are looking for products with better environmental or social characteristics. An example here, for example, is aluminum cans relative to plastic bottles. As concerns about plastic pollution have increased around the world, you have seen that, for example, manufacturers of aluminum cans have experienced superior revenue growth, as many of the bottling and beverage manufacturers are shifting to aluminum cans. And why is this happening? Well, because one of the reasons is because plastic is just so hard to recycle. Separating polymers as part of the process is a very costly process, and as a result, it's really hard to recycle. It's not impossible, it's just costly and it's hard. At the same time, although aluminum is very polluting to actually mine, once you have mined it and once has used, it's much easier to recycle. And in fact, it can be recycled over and over and over again. And as a result, as more companies are trying to move towards circular business models and towards circularity, where products are reused, recycled, and recollected over time, some companies have seen that their products are actually substituting for other products because they tend to have better characteristics. And as a result, those companies have been able to experience revenue growth because of that substitution. That is quite different, actually, from a strategy that is driven by fundamental product innovation driven strategy that again affects revenue growth, but is not happening because of substitution for another product, but it's happening because fundamentally you're trying to create a very different product to begin with. Here is where you will find some both pure play aligned companies, but also companies that are trying to transform their businesses. And a good example here, both on the pure play aligned side, but also on the business transformation side, you can find in auto manufacturers, for example. On the one side, you have what I call pure play aligned. For example, new electric vehicle manufacturers, ranging from Tesla to Lucid to NIO in China, BYD, and so forth. These are companies that have been created with electrification of mobility in mind. They don't have legacy necessarily operations, and they're actually being singular focused on that. In other markets, you can find the same pattern as well. For example, in food and agriculture, there are companies that are purely drip irrigation companies that have enormous impact actually in terms of reducing water needed in agriculture and reducing methane. Or actually food companies that are concentrating on healthier food relative to just large conglomerates that might have all kinds of options. Those pure play aligned companies, of course, are harder to implement compared to the other three elements that we have discussed so far, but the opportunity for value creation is tremendous. They are disrupting markets, they're disrupting actually existing competitive landscapes, and they are delivering enormous value actually, both for consumers, but creating new markets and creating also tremendous amount of revenue growth for themselves. On the flip side, you have what I call business transformation. Again, go back to the example that I just gave with auto manufacturers. These are the existing legacy auto manufacturers that are trying to pivot from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric mobility. This will be the General Motors of the world that are making quite a bit of progress, but at the same time, they have to straddle two businesses at the same time, the legacy business and the new business that you're trying to create. So this is a fundamental innovation challenge that they're having in their hands. And it's really interesting and really important to be thinking about those two types as we're thinking about product innovation. And of course, those two types, the pure play aligned and the business transformation, have different challenges. Pure play aligned companies need to establish their own brand. They don't have a brand to begin with. These are disruptive new startups, new entrepreneurial activities. They need to secure financing. They need to establish distribution channels and so forth. But at the same time, they don't have all the processes, routines, incentives that might be holding them back from them making the transition. So sometimes actually, although the legacy companies have more financing, stronger balance sheets, stronger brands, and so forth, it's actually more difficult for them to make those transitions because of those established processes, routines, and mindsets that exist inside organizations. And at the same time, when we're looking at product innovation, we have what I call basically new market archetypes. These are companies that are creating completely new markets that might not even have existed before. Think about, for example, companies that are applying machine learning, computer vision to actually scan around the world and through the use of satellite imaging to understand soil degradation, purchase or lease land around the world, and work with farmers around the world to implement better agricultural practices that are increasing the yields of crops and at the same time restoring soil to create carbon sinks and create carbon credits that can be traded and that can be sold in voluntary carbon markets, for example. So we observe companies and entrepreneurial activities creating completely new markets that didn't even exist before. Of course, as you can understand that, the opportunity for value creation is tremendous. But at the same time, the implementation difficulty is tremendous as well. It's actually really difficult to create some of those value chains. And it's actually really challenging to align incentives across the whole value chain when you're thinking about some of those models. But for me, it's really important to be thinking about those 6 archetypes and along the dimensions of opportunity for value creation, but also implementation risk and how they differ as you're moving across them and how those are being implemented both by legacy organizations, but also by entrepreneurial activities and startups that are actually disrupting the competitive landscape. And one of the common elements that we're thinking and that we're finding in our research as we're thinking across all of them is that those 2 dimensions that I'm showing you here are extremely important. The first one is remaining focused, meaning that you cannot do everything for everyone when you're thinking about purpose-driven organizations that are trying to have a positive impact on society. There are so many issues. The question is, what are the most critical ones and how you can actually focus your activities? So return on management, time, is an extremely important concept, and you need to remain focused. The second element, and this is the horizontal axis, is that you need to actually differentiate operational effectiveness from strategy, going back to the fundamentals of strategy, and understand that actually strategy is about your uniqueness, and it's about actually what you adopt as unique practices. So in one of the papers that we have done with a colleague of mine, we have actually been able to differentiate between what we call common practices and unique practices and show that in the sustainability domain, it's actually unique practices, what makes you different than your competitors, that is actually able to drive performance improvements, both in the return on capital, but also valuation multiples. And as we're thinking about that, one of the things that I describe in the book is that the typical journey that most companies are going through as they are thinking about their sustainability issues and how they can make a positive difference in the world is this 3-stage model. Most of the companies initially view most of those activities from a compliance perspective. How can I make sure that I don't do anything so bad that will get me into a reputation trouble or a legal trouble or a regulatory trouble? And as those efforts are maturing, what is happening is that most organizations are starting to think and identify operational efficiency elements to that. And as a result, that makes them more competitive from a cost perspective. And it's only a few organizations that are able to move to the third element, which is what I call growth and innovation perspective. This is where you're actually finding all the types of product innovations that are happening inside companies that are actually able to tie the strategy of the organization to the product innovation process and to their ability to create impact on the customer side of things through their actual products and services. So you can ask the question about why is it so difficult for many organizations to move across that journey and to reach that growth and innovation perspective? And not the single factor, not the only factor, but an important factor is definitely this ability about the leaders to create an environment where employees feel empowered to contribute towards that product innovation, and that they feel that actually they can take the necessary risks and communicate with their colleagues in the pursuit of actually creating solutions with a more positive impact on society. So I think that slide right here illustrates the importance of leadership in those conversations and the importance that leaders have creating a high trust environment where employees feel that they can actually take the necessary risks, experiment, collaborate, share information in the pursuit of innovation. And the second element that is extremely important alongside that leadership commitment is this graph right here, which is actually very counterintuitive, and it was very counterintuitive to me actually in the first time. I always thought that as you are moving across the spectrum of compliance, efficiency, and growth and innovation, what you will find is more centralization of decision rights when it comes to sustainability issues. So think about, for example, the creation of chief sustainability officers in organizations, the creation of sustainability departments or ESG departments. They come in different names across different organizations. But one of the things that we have found in our research is that for organizations that are moving towards that growth and innovation perspective, actually the driver is decentralization, not centralization. And this is a very, very important learning for me, because fundamentally, to move towards more efficiency, what is happening is that you're actually centralizing the decision rights inside the organization. You actually need to centralize the authority and how decisions are being made, to create departments, to assign roles in people, and so forth, because you need to create the critical momentum for those practices to diffuse throughout the organization. But fundamentally, to start actually looking at environmental and social and governance issues as opportunities for creating products and services that solve people's problems, you actually need to decentralize that ownership and the decision rights across the different business units and across the different functions. And people that might not have necessarily sustainability or ESG as part of their titles, they need to own those activities and they need to drive performance towards those activities. So that is actually another element that we have uncovered alongside leadership commitment that is a critical element when it comes to how can you actually move towards growth and innovation, and how can you move as an organization to create more and more value and at the same time overcome some of those implementation difficulties that exist. And I just want to show you one example from one case that I have written on another very large advanced materials companies more recently that had exactly this problem of decentralization. And one of the things that they did is they created this management tool that actually allows everybody inside the organization to make research and development decisions, capital expenditure decisions, mergers and acquisition decisions, hiring decisions, supply chain decisions. And one of the things that they did is they said, let's actually try to map all our product applications, more than 1,000 product applications that they have, along two axes. The first one, the vertical one, is the amount, and this is a very heavy industrial use company. So for them, environmental issues are very, very important. For other companies, it will be something different. It doesn't need to be the same thing, but they identify this because they are in the heavy industrial use case. On the vertical axis, what they did is they asked the question, how environmentally damaging and polluting it is for us to create each one of our products from cradle to gate, meaning from the point of extraction, including ORA supply chain issues, to including operations. For anybody that has been knowledgeable and involved in the environmental space, for example, when you're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, that will include your upstream scope 3 emissions, plus your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions. But also it will include many other issues, such as, for example, the creation of particulate matters, or nitrous oxide and sulfur oxide, or water consumption in water scarce areas, and so forth. And they said, well, let's try to measure all of those issues for each one of our products along a vertical axis. And once we can measure it, and then we have a shadow cost for those damages. Let's try to create a monetary measure that reflects all of those environmental damages that each one of our products creates. And once we have that measure, let's actually divide it by the price of the product. And that gives you a percentage of the price of the product that is actually coming from those environmental damages. And then you can actually classify your product applications from very high risk to very low risk based on that ratio of basically monetized environmental damages per price of the product. And on the second axis, they actually evaluated the market attractiveness of the product from the perspective of, is this solving our customers' environmental problems? Is this actually providing a product that is solving the problems of our automobile manufacturer as customers, of our airplane manufacturers, as for example, Boeing and Airbus? Is this solving their problem? And many of the other customers that we might have. And they created a survey instrument that have been able to actually administer across many of their employees that are deeply knowledgeable of those industries, and then identify products as very aligned products to very challenged products based on evolving environmental regulations around the world and customer needs around the world. And what you can see here now, I have a matrix. I have a matrix where I can actually classify products along two dimensions. How much, if I was forced to internalize those environmental damages, how much of my price and as a result my margin might be squeezed, and at the same time, how likely it is that the product is actually solving the problem of one of our customers. And the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side that you see there, wrapped around green, is what they call solutions products. And the left lower hand side is actually what you see called challenged products. And once they actually had this tool, they were able to find that, look, actually, if you look historically, what is happening is that our solutions products are actually growing at 4% year on year in terms of their revenues. But actually, our challenge products are actually losing ground and losing market share by about 5%. So that has allowed them to actually tilt where the research and development investments are going, and where actually the organization need to invest resources in order to remain competitive in the future. And that tool has allowed decentralization, going back to our previous discussion, because now it has become objective. It has become not based on the subjective views that people have, but as objective and as reliable as possible, and a management tool that can guide decisions across different business units and across different functions inside the organization. And that has been critically important in terms of how organizations can actually decentralize some of those activities if they want to start innovating. So with that, I'm looking very much forward to your questions. Thank you very much for the attention, and we can take those slides down. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Serafim. You have inspired me years ago, and you continue to inspire so many others in both corporate America and the future leaders of our businesses. We have some questions that are coming in our chat. I encourage everyone to please use the functionality in this platform if you'd like to ask a question. I also would like to encourage all of you to please look for this book. It is an excellent opportunity for you to really learn new insights, purpose and profit. It is an excellent publication. I recommend it highly. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you for our first question. Thank you again, George. So appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Hi, George. So how did you get started in this field? Were you like a teenager who wanted to lift up the world? And within that context, how long did it take you to get that first paper published?
You know, David, it's such a great question. And I have to say, I start the book, really the first sentence of the book, with a confession, which is, I think many years ago, I wouldn't have read this book myself. So it's actually counterintuitive that I wrote the book. And the reason for that is because I just didn't feel like this was something that was relevant to my career. I grew up in Greece, and then I moved to London to study and to work there, and then I moved to Boston, and I was just trying to to create a career, like make some money, and like create a better future, to be honest with you. um, but at the same time, what I observed and how I started getting interested in this field is, one, we had these very big challenges in front of us, ranging from issues such as, for example, climate change and environmental degradation, to issues of access and opportunity to things like financial services and capital, access to health, access to skilling, education, opportunities for so many people in the United States, but also around the world. And I tend to look at those challenges as actually opportunities for business to create models that actually provide those services, provide access and opportunity to people, and deploy the innovative capacity and the agile spirit of business to start creating solutions to some of those problems. And of course, business cannot do it on its own, right? I mean, we need to have the right regulations, the right government actions, the right incentives, and the right actually capacity from all other actors of the economy to provide those solutions. But for me, that was a deeply exciting moment. And at the same time, I was observing the digital transformation that I described before. And I hypothesized that the world will become a much more transparent place, and we will be able to measure things that we have been never able to measure before. And that would revolutionize things, actually. And that's why one of the lab that I lead here now at Harvard Business School is in this intersection between the digital and the AI transformation and the sustainability transformation, because I think those things are interconnecting very well together. And as a result, it will create an enormous amount of opportunity for entrepreneurs, for startups, but also for transformation of organizations. And as a result, a tremendous amount of investment opportunities when you're thinking actually about that. So that's a little bit of how I started in this place. And David, to your point, it took many, many years to publish that first paper, because it was a very new field. And I think whenever you're actually engaging in something new, and by the way, that's one of the elements that I describe in the book as well, in some sense, both from a managerial perspective, but also from an entrepreneurial perspective, when you're actually trying to do something new, you're assuming higher levels of risk than you would be assuming otherwise, because it's something novel. And I think that was probably the case for me as well. So I learned from that, and I observed that happening in many entrepreneurs, in many managers that took a step back and wanted to do something different.
As you did something different in your research, so you faced the same challenges as corporations do, publishing in a field that others were not focused on. So it was very brave. We have other questions coming in, David. I think one may be some phrases in Greek, which I'm not sure I can pronounce, but I'm going to toss that one to you if you'd like.
Sure.
I haven't seen it, but once I see it, I will be able to do it.
I hope they're clean words. Sean Nowicki, address you Kalispera. Is that okay?
Yes, that's pretty good, David.
Kalispera.
How do individuals who care deeply about corporate purpose and social impact get buy-in from senior leadership who are resistant to sustainability and social impact efforts? And I know you do cover this a little in the book.
Yes.
Yes. It's such an important question, right? And I think, and I have taught basically elements of that for so many years. And I think it's really important to have several elements here. The first one, and I cannot emphasize that enough, is you need to do your homework, meaning that you need to have basically the facts and really understanding, become master of your craft, right, in many ways. If you want to, for example, be an investor that invests, let's say, in climate tech startups and you're interested in that, well, you better know very well how the battery manufacturing value chain is changing, the underlying unit economics of that, or how ag tech is changing, all of those things. The point is, and the same thing if you want to become a manager inside your organization, going out and saying, well, we should offer this other product without understanding bottlenecks, supply chain bottlenecks, pricing issues, willingness to pay issues, supply chain issue, like all of those things is not going to work. So the first thing that I say is you need to really to master your craft and to become master of your craft. The second thing is that you need to actually provide a solution, not only just talk about a problem. I can very easily come up with lots of problems. The question is, do I have actually an actionable solution, right? And the third element is not to let the perfect become the enemy of progress. If you actually go inside an organization, senior leadership, and say, let's change everything, let's go from 0 to 100 and so forth, people will say, hold on a second. So the question is, how do you actually create positive momentum inside the organization? In the book, I described that quite a bit, which is it is super important to actually show blueprints of change and blueprints of success, and how organizations can actually move from 0 to 3% and 5% and 10%. And that actually creates a lot of excitement inside the organization, because you show that it's feasible, you show that actually it's scalable, and you show that it's actually something that is truly sustainable, meaning from a timing perspective, durable, right? So I think bringing people with you and creating lots of initially small applications that are showing the point to create excitement and positive momentum inside the organizations is actually extremely important. So I would emphasize many of those elements: becoming master of your craft and knowing exactly about what's happening, and seeing that as an evolution and a perspective of creating positive momentum inside the organizations, bringing people along. I think it goes a long way towards creating buy-in among senior leadership.
Barbara, you want to take the next one? Or?
Yeah, what I was thinking is the another question we have really as perfect timing from this concept of movement and progress and the timing. And the question comes from Ali, and she asked, do you find that people jump to focusing on the number 3rd growth in your chart, where it's growth and innovation, before doing the other 2? So we're all waiting for the SEC to tell us what our requirements will be, and we're getting ready for reporting in this country. So you've shared that being as the first step. Do you see that it may not be something that's done in an order and organizations jump about?
Empirically, we have very rarely seen that, actually. We have seen that in general, this is a journey. And I think this is a journey for the reason that we just discussed before, which is actually you need to create some type of positive momentum inside the organizations. And the easier things to do generally tend to be the other 2 stages. The 3rd stage is actually where the payoffs are very uncertain, implementation risk is much higher, and so forth. So one of the things that we have seen is that in general, this is a journey that organizations travel, but in general, most organizations do not reach that 3rd stage because of the reasons that we discussed before. That doesn't mean that it cannot happen. I always say that, like in social sciences and in organizations and in human behavior, everything can happen, right? Because human behavior is so complex. But does it tend to happen? And the answer to that is not typically.
Very good. Very insightful.
Is greenwashing a problem? These corporations saying they're going to do the right thing, but not necessarily doing the right thing. What's your experience with that?
I think it is a challenge, right? And I think it's a natural evolution, right? So the way that I tend to think about it, David, is that whenever you actually create stronger incentives for somebody to actually show a certain credential, then actually you also create incentives for people to game the system, right? So because you create incentives for people to indeed fulfill those credentials, but you also create incentives for people to game the nature of those credentials. So that's why I have been a big proponent of outcome-based measurement, meaning not judging so much the intentions and the efforts, but judging more the outcomes of this. And actually, if you think about it, when you actually look at a lot of the ratings and the metrics infrastructure and the disclosures that companies are making, when you actually look at ESG ratings and so forth, a lot of that, not all of that, but a lot of that is input-based measurement, meaning lots of principles, policies, disclosures, targets, and so forth. The way that you can get around the greenwashing issue is to concentrate on actual outcome-based measures, which basically ask the question, how much, for example, you might be decarbonizing your operations, at what pace, at what time horizon, and how much of that is included in those measurements. That, in general, outcome-based metrics are much harder to engage in cheap talk relative to input-based measures, right? Like, so if the two of us, for example, we say, we go to our physician in the beginning of the year and we say, like, we will behave healthier this year, right? It's much easier for us to cheap talk, like, and say, we have a commitment to go to the gym every day, not to eat X amount of sugar and so forth. But actually, where the rubber meets the road is once we actually go to the next visit and somebody says, have you actually lost weight? That is much harder to trick, right? It's the same idea.
Right. And just a quick follow-up on that. You mentioned many companies. Do you want to give any shout outs to good behavior companies that have those kind of results? Or just read the book and you can find them?
You read the book and you can find a bunch of them. But I think that is a journey that many organizations are actually traveling, right? And I also want us to, because sometimes you see, and we shift all the way to the other end, right? And many times now you will read in the news always about greenwashing, and somehow it is being portrayed as like this is all that is happening, right? That is not true either. Actually, there are very, very meaningful efforts that are happening, and there are many organizations that are doing incredible work, right? So it's not like either or, right? It comes in all kinds of shades, and I think some organizations are truly committing, and they are doing incredible work, actually. And there are some other organizations that are speaking kind of like rather than acting, right? So, and I think when we think about the evolution of where we are, we still as a society haven't really developed the accountability structures to hold people accountable for the statements that they make. So I like to make this comparison that actually, if you go back decades ago, it was very, very similar to financial accounting and capital markets. People were kind of like making all kinds of disclosures. They were calculating earnings metrics and revenue metrics in any kind of way that they wanted. And over time, as a society, and David, you know that very well, big part of the Museum of American Finance, as a society, we said, look, we have to create the rules and norms as a society, accounting standards, auditing regulations, securities regulations, and so forth, to make sure that we have reliable, relevant, comparable measures, and that we all understand. The same thing, I think we are in the same journey right now.
Absolutely. And in your description of different measurements, the external ones are the ones that are objective. Those are the ones that you can opine upon. The auditors can review because there's information that you can look at it through a lens that is not biased. So these are wonderful insights. David, any other questions you'd like to
Sure. I mean, there's several that have come in. So Adish is asking, thank you, of course, but a fire hose of innovation and ideas. Can you talk about, hold on, just scroll this transformation. on the corporate side of economy is making institutional investors relook at the investment process? Will it not make common sense for investors to tackle issues like decarbonization to create value?
I think that evolution is happening on the investment space as well, right? So the way that I think about it is that all of those issues are actually changing in terms of how important they are. Different issues have different levels of importance across different geographical, industrial context, and firm strategies. And investors are also trying to understand the value relevance of those issues and develop the types of research and data systems and also knowledge within the investment team infrastructure on how different issues are affecting the future profitability, margins, growth of organizations around the world. I think I would distinguish that relative to what mostly is happening in the investment world, which is trying to create some type of baseline data infrastructure that you can measure in a quantitative way and embed in quantitative models that allows you to have broadly diversified portfolios that optimize for a specific characteristic. I think that has happened a lot. I think the fundamental analysis from a business analysis and valuation perspective is something that is in the earlier stages of development. It's happening more and more, I would say, within private equity, for example, that has longer or ownership horizons and understands how do you build actually great businesses and how do you actually accelerate growth and margin and so forth. And it's happening a lot also in thematic funds that are starting to actually think about the transformation of the economy and which sectors of the economy might experience really significant innovations across different value chains. But I would say it's still in the early stages of development, although when you read the news and the media, they will quote trillions of dollars and so forth. The underlying maturity, I would say, of the knowledge and the expertise that exists in most organizations is still very varying, from very sophisticated to very poorly sophisticated. And I would say we're still in the relatively early stages of development.
Good. I think, Barbara, it's okay. We should use Paulo's question and broaden it out for the final one.
You and I are thinking the same thing.
And it's a question George gets all the time. So yes. Paulo's a recent graduate. He's Italian, a finance class, good grades. But what is your suggestion to a 25-year-old man that's starting his career in finance?
It's a great question, and David, as you said, I get that question very, very much. I think my recommendation is always surround yourself with people that you feel that you can learn from, that you feel that you can acquire a great amount of knowledge. For example, in this context, great investors that you feel that they will help you master your craft. Align yourself and surround yourself with people that you also have alignment in terms of like your goals and your aspirations and your values as well. And there is an incredible amount of opportunity actually out there. But I think maximizing the amount of learning that you can engage in initially is extremely, extremely important, because it goes back to the previous question that we're discussing, which is you need to become a master of your craft. Your ability your license to differentiate, your license to do great, great things is conditional on proving that you are a master of your craft. So that is extremely, extremely important. And that's something that I emphasize quite a bit in the book across multiple chapters, that we have seen either investors or managers and leaders in general that are able to tackle big problems and really make a difference. They have, all of them, this common characteristic, which is an incredible track record and being masters of their craft.
And if I can add to the advice, if for those who are with us today, to get along your journey and getting to be a master, buy the book, read this. And I follow George on Twitter. I look for your notifications. They're done in a very timely way, and it keeps me current. And I think we all sometimes get overloaded with a lot of different messages and suggestions on what to read to stay current. So I also would suggest for those who are listening to follow George on Twitter. He does do some great tweets, and it really does help keep me current. So I appreciate them very much. David, if you have anything to add, or we shall shift over, what would you like to?
I think we should go to our close.
Well, wonderful. So may I personally thank you again for being with us today. And I would like to now move to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Lerzan Aksoy.
Thank you, Barbara. And George, this has been such an inspiring conversation. And I think we all join you in the hope of a future where we will see many more companies moving from this compliance to cost reduction to viewing sustainability and ESG as a revenue generator that is tied to innovation and growth, because such innovations can not only enrich our experiences as consumers, but they really can stimulate our imagination of what is possible, what we want our world to be, and helping to alleviate some of the world's most pressing problems. So once again, thank you so much for being here with us, George. Today was the last in the speaker series organized by Fordham's Gabelli School, the Museum of Finance, and the CFA Society of New York. But we will be kicking off the new year with a special live event on January 31st at Fordham University's Lincoln Center campus here in the heart of Manhattan, featuring Paul Johnson and Paul Sonkin and their new book, The Enduring Value of Roger Murray. They'll provide a compelling account of Murray's multifaceted career alongside a series of remarkable lectures he gave late in his life that encapsulated his philosophy of investing. And they will be joined by two legendary investors and students that Roger Murray mentored, Leon Cooperman and our school's namesake, Mario Gabelli. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.